This is a revision video about the GCSE Biology topic selective breeding. It comes up in paper 2 of AQA GCSE Biology and Combined Science as part of the Variation and Evolution unit. In this video we're going to briefly explain why farmers and other groups use selective breeding. We'll identify some of the most common examples of characteristics that are selected for, describe the steps in the process of selective breeding and explain why it may lead to health problems. To set the scene, let's quickly refresh our memories about natural selection. If you haven't already studied this in depth, there is a full-length video about natural selection, but for those of us that have, this is just a very brief recap. So the first step of natural selection requires variation, and that variation has to come from somewhere. This will either be from mutation, or it could be from sexual reproduction, which is leading novel combinations of alleles to be put together. And that's particularly the case if we're talking about something physical like height that's controlled by lots and lots of different genes. So we now have a population where all of the individuals are slightly different. That's what we call variation. And that means that when a selection pressure comes along, they're going to respond differently to it. So that selection pressure might be there not being enough food, or it might be that there's a predator that's trying to eat you, or it might be that there aren't enough pollinators to spread your pollen and allow you to have offspring with other plants. And so whichever organisms and individuals are best adapted, they're the ones that are likely to have the most offspring. So that might be that you've got a bird that has a better adapted beak so it can get more food and therefore it stays alive for longer and it has more chicks. Or it might be that you have a plant that has bigger flowers that are more attractive to the insects that pollinate it, so it spreads more pollen because more insects visit it and therefore it's able to produce more seeds with other plants. Whichever organisms are able to survive and breed the most, they're going to pass on more of their alleles to the next generation because they have more offspring in the next generation. And then this process is going to go on and on and on and repeat. And after many generations, it's possible that the whole population will have the new trait. So maybe the entire population of plants all have those same bigger, more attractive flowers. Now, if natural selection is so successful, why are farmers and breeders not just leaving the makeup of their herds and crops up to this natural process? There are two main reasons. The first one is that they might want to select for something that actually isn't in the best interests of the species, something that doesn't make them fitter. So you could think of this like a farmer who's growing flowers and he particularly wants to grow more of these bright blue flowers because people really like them and will pay more money for them. But it might be that the insects that pollinate the blue flowers, well, they're not such a big fan of blue and they actually go to those flowers less frequently. So left up to natural selection, those flowers would become increasingly rare, but actually they're what the farmer wants. And so he couldn't use natural selection, he actually needs to use selective breeding. Another example of this might be a farmer who is keeping beef cattle, and he wants those cattle to have as much muscle as possible because that's what the meat is that we eat. But you're going to eventually reach a point where having more muscle isn't a good thing for the cow. It actually starts to impede its movement and make it less healthy. But the farmer just wants bigger and bigger cows, so again he'd have to use selective breeding. The other reason is that natural selection is just really slow. Both natural selection and selective breeding are going to take multiple generations, but natural selection is going to take several more. In each generation, only the offspring of the parent who had the trait are going to inherit those alleles. So it has to take multiple generations because one parent might only have 4 offspring. So in the next generation, we've only got 4 individuals with that trait and we want the whole population to have it. So that's going to take quite a long time. But the other thing is that even if the trait that we want to select for is one that can be selected for by natural selection, there are probably going to be several different traits that are being selected for at the same time. Say you had a population of birds. One of them is really good at getting more food, maybe it has a better adapted beak. One of them is really good at evading predation, and one of them lays more eggs. All 3 of those things are positives for the population, but they're all being selected for at the same time. So each one of those birds only has ever so slightly more reproductive success. If you compare that to selective breeding, let's say what we were really interested in was laying more eggs. We could take the bird that lays more eggs and take its eggs and put them in an incubator and make sure that all of them survived, and we could just not let any of the other eggs survive. So we could select for that one trait absolutely and make sure that every individual that had that trait survived. And so we're speeding up this process of natural selection. So just to clarify, because we haven't really defined it yet, selective breeding is a much faster way to generate a population of favourable individuals. So that basically means a group of organisms that all have the trait we're interested in. And it's how farmers and breeders achieve a population that have a particular desired characteristic. Here are some examples of the most commonly selected for traits. Firstly, disease resistance. A huge proportion of the food crops that our farmers grow are lost to pests like aphids or diseases like blight, and if one variety of a crop starts to show resistance to a particular disease, then the farmer will select those individuals to try to cultivate a crop that are all resistant and thereby prevent the loss of yield and ultimately money. Then there's breeding domestic cattle and sheep for more milk or more meat or more wool. Then there's breeding domesticated dog or cat breeds to make sure that they've got a gentle nature and they make good pets. And then in horticulture, breeding plants that have flowers that are large or unusual colours or heavily scented. All of these mean more money for the farmer or the breeder. The process of selective breeding is actually very similar to natural selection, except instead of waiting to see who survives and breeds, the farmer is picking based on something that may not actually be an advantage for survival. So we start out with a mixed population, and from that mixed population that contains variation, we're going to choose 2 individuals that have the desired characteristic. We're then going to allow them to breed, or in many cases artificially inseminate them, which produces offspring that have a range of characteristics. Remember, there's still variation in the parents, and they're each only passing on half of their alleles, so not all of the babies will come out exactly as you want them to. Then we're going to choose the few offspring that have the most desired traits and either breed these together, or you can do something called a back cross, where you breed them with one of the parents. And then you repeat this crossbreeding process over many generations until all of the offspring show the desired characteristic. This process has to be done quite carefully to avoid a problem called inbreeding, which is where closely genetically related individuals have offspring which are born with genetic diseases. This happens because actually most individuals are carrying the alleles for some genetic diseases, but because these are recessive, they're hidden by the dominant allele. However, if 2 siblings have offspring, if one of them has the allele for a genetic disease, there's a 50% chance that so does the other. This means there's a very high likelihood that when they have offspring together, they will have a baby that is born with the disease. This isn't just true for full sibling matings. The risk is 4 times smaller for first cousins or 16 times smaller for second cousins, but that's still a pretty huge risk, and it's part of the reason why many domesticated dog breeds have major health problems. Another disadvantage of selective breeding is that because all of the animals or all of the plants come from one line, there's a general overall reduction in genetic variation. This means that the population can't really evolve anymore or adapt to changes in the environment, and something that affects one of the plants is going to affect all of them. So it might be that in the original population you had one particular type of plant that was particularly susceptible to drought, and so if it was a really hot summer, then all of the plants like that would have died, and that might have been a quarter of your crop. But now that you've gone through this selection process and all of the plants are like that, as soon as the drought starts, all of your plants die. Now that we've described how to do selective breeding and also what some of the drawbacks are, here's an opportunity to check that you have understood this. So pause the video and see if you can write down some bullet points that describe how a farmer could breed sheep that produce more wool. So our first step is to select our parents. From the herd or from the population, we're going to select 2 parents that produce the most wool, and obviously we need a male and a female. Then those are going to be bred together, and they're going to have offspring, and from the offspring we will pick the male and the female that produce the most wool. We're then going to breed those together, and we're going to repeat this process for several generations. Here are a couple more shorter questions. Can you suggest why the sheep might be more susceptible to genetic defects, so more likely to have them? And can you suggest why a new disease could be problematic for these sheep? So the sheep are more likely to have genetic defects because they've been produced by inbreeding, and therefore with the siblings mating together they may have passed on the same recessive allele for a genetic disease. A new disease might be problematic because there's now a lack of genetic variation in the population, so if one is susceptible to the disease, they all will be. Hopefully that's been a useful recap of the selective breeding topic. Thank you very much for watching, and if you did find the video useful, then don't forget to like and also hit the subscribe button below for more biology videos coming soon.